Today we're going to check the balancer shaft bearings in this 430 RR 4-stroke beater. First thing to do is to drain the coolant out by removing this bolt here and catching the water that comes out in a suitable container, like that. If you have difficulty getting the water out, if you loosen the radiator cap, you can increase the flow, but be ready for it. So this nut here, this bolt here, has a copper crush washer behind it to seal up the hole, so don't lose it. Okay, it's quite a long screw, but you can see the copper washer and the screw, so let's pull the screw all the way out. Put that to one side. Yeah, as we can see, no water's coming out, so we need to undo the radiator cap. Flows out quite fast once you unscrew the radiator cap a little bit to let the air come in at the top and let the water flow out at the bottom. So that's all the coolant drained out of this hole here. The next job is to take off all of the bolts holding this right hand side cover on. Now if you leave these two bolts in here, it'll keep the clutch cover connected to that, so it'll save you disturbing the gasket between those two, because you don't need to. And if you're careful, you should get away without damaging the gasket on here. Now of course all of the engine oil has been drained out of the other side, and all of the gearbox oil has been drained out of the right hand side, as you would normally expect. The brake lever will be in the way, but if you disconnect this spring and then you back off the rear brake pads so that when you push this down there's no pressure exerted on the disc, this lever will push down far enough to clear this, to get it removed. So even though there's no oil in the gearbox or the engine, there will be some residual oil left in here which will pour out when you remove the cover, so be prepared for that. So with the right hand cover off, we can check the balancer shaft. This is the balancer shaft. It's an eccentrically weighted shaft that's driven at the same speed as the crankshaft, which is this one, and it's driven 1-to-1, so they spin at the same speed. And it's just to, doesn't do anything for the engine, but it just makes the user less aware of the vibration, just dampens the vibration down for the end user. But I've checked the play in this. It's got a roller bearing in it, which changed about 20 hours away, and although there's a tiny bit of play, I mean, roller bearing will always have a tiny bit of play in it, I suppose, but it seems okay. But what doesn't seem okay is the clutch basket, which has a roller bearing around it. If you look at there seems to be a little bit of play in that, so I'm going to take these 6 studs off here so I can remove the clutch and have a look to see if the bearing behind there needs replacing. Now I've got the clutch out of the way, we can inspect the balancer shaft bearings. That's the balancer shaft, crankshaft, gearbox input shaft. Now these are metal oil pump gears that have already been fitted. That's the actual oil pump input shaft there, and that's just the idler gear. But these things need changing. It, don't know, is it 60 hours, 90 hours? Can't remember now. These bearings on the balancer shaft, there's a roller bearing in this end, and at the opposite end under the the magneto cover, there's a thrust bearing, so this bearing at this end is more likely to wear out first because it runs on the outer race as a can round it, which gets pushed into the case, but the shaft actually runs on the needles, so the shaft can wear. But yeah, now that everything's out of the way, there is a fair bit of play on that. I'm only doing it with one hand now. If you do it with two hands, you can actually hear it. So it looks like it might be a good idea for me to take that out and inspect it. Just as a heads up that you don't need to remove the clutch. I've removed the clutch because I wanted to check the roller bearing that sits in the middle of the clutch basket, because there seems to be a lot of play in it, so I'm going to replace that while it's out. Just on another aside, this bolt just here, if you remove that, you'll find a copper washer behind it. If you remove it, then remove the copper washer and set the engine to top dead centre, there's a cutout in the crank web, and that's what you use to lock the engine at top dead centre, which is what you're going to need to do to get the nut off the other side of the balancer shaft when we take that other side off and have a look. The balancer shaft has alignment marks on it. There's a spot there, and on the other gear, if you see just here, you'll see a pair of spots. So as these two gears go round, that spot has to sit in between the two spots on the other gear that drives it. That's to ensure that it's in the correct position to do its balancing job. Okay, so on the left hand side of the engine, we've now removed the generator stator cover. Again, you've got one of these screws has got a copper washer behind it, so, and it's that one there, so don't get that mixed up. So over here, what we've now got to remove is this nut off the left hand side of the balancer shaft. It's thread locked, so we're going to need to lock the crankshaft by using the screw that we saw earlier. So I'll take the screw out, I'll take the copper washer off it, then with the copper washer off it screws in further and it'll screw into the recess in the crankshaft, and it'll stop the crankshaft turning. The other modification I've made is I've drilled, and I'm not suggesting that anybody should do this to their bike, but to enable me to get this, there's a tiny plate behind the chain guide which holds the bearing in position. It's got a Torx screw which is thread locked, and unless you take the head and the cylinders off the bike, you can't get on to undo the screw. So I've drilled this hole through the web of the bottom half of the plastic chain guide. But like I say, I'm not suggesting anybody should do this to their bike. This is just what I've done to my bike, so that it enabled me to get this out without stripping the entire engine down. Okay, we're going to remove the screw out of the crankcase, and you'll notice that it's got a point on the end. It leaves behind this copper washer, which we're going to need to pull out. It kind of plugs in, so you're just going to need to really carefully pry it out without damaging it or distorting it. Okay, there's the clear hole without the copper washer in it, and there's the copper washer. So it basically plugs into the recess in here. So now I'm going to set the engine at top dead centre so that the hole in the crank web is in line with this hole, and then I'll screw the pointed screw back in, which will now screw in further because the copper washer isn't holding it away. and that point will sit into the recess on the crankwheel. With the engine locked at top dead centre, you should be able to see the marks line up. So you've got the spot on the balancer shaft, and it sits in between the two spots on the crankshaft drive gear. Now with the nut removed, I can push the balancer shaft backwards to enable me to remove the counterweight off the left hand side of the engine, because now I can rotate it round into position where I can withdraw it. And out it comes. This only goes on one way, so you can't get it wrong. In here now you can see the left hand side bearing, you can see the head of the countersunk screw holding in the metal plate, which keeps the bearing in place. Now we can extract the counterbalancer shaft carefully, and we can inspect it and obviously the bearings. On this balancer shaft where you can see the eccentric weight, and you can see obviously there's more load because of the eccentricity of this shaft, so there's more wear where the weight is, as opposed to the opposite side where the weight isn't, where there's barely any wear. You can sort of see it as I turn this around, you can sort of see the wear coming in further round towards the weight that you get. Now on this shaft is some, I don't know whether you can see it on the video, but there's like a score mark, and I can actually feel a lip if I run my fingernail up to it. So I think this shaft needs replacing. What the actual life on these shafts is, I don't know. This particular bike's done about 180 hours now. So there we go. Time for a new shaft, I think. On this shaft there's actually a groove worn in it with this knife. I think you can hear, but the knife actually sits in this groove, so that's not good. The groove's about 8 to 10 millimeters long, and you can feel roughness. But this should be nice and smooth all the way across, like this section here. So that shaft is no good. Couple of points to watch out for on this side. The oil seal here has to be pushed in flush with its recess. Don't rely on the fact that the bearing will push it in when you push the roller bearing in, so you need to get something which fits into the recess really well like that, so that you can push the rubber seal flat against its sort of backstop. Because when you put this bearing in, it sits out flush with this face, outer face here. It doesn't want to push in until it touches the rubber seal, so the rubber seal has to be seated, because as you push this bearing in, this bearing won't seat that seal, and if you do it that way, you'll starve it of oil. There's a hole just here, and that hole runs down into here and has a corresponding hole which lets the oil out. So oil that gets sprayed around in here lands on this hole, and this hole's kind of points downwards. So oil rolls down here, flows down here, and gets into the gap. When the bearing's pushed in flush with this face, there's a little gap in between the back of the bearing and this rubber seal. So the oil filters down in between the two and feeds the roller bearing with oil. Same as these dished holes here. So when it's sat flush with these, and you've got the balancer shaft back in, the balancer shaft doesn't go past here. So these little oil ways do the same thing. So you've got inner and outer oil ways that just work off gravity to feed the roller bearing. So be careful when fitting that back together. So I'm poking this in the oil way now, in the gap between the back of the bearing and the oil seal. It's not a huge gap, but there is a gap there all the same. Well, I mean, that is a mil or so. There's another oil way to consider on this side, and it's where this little brass insert goes. So it's a good idea to blast this through with some carburetor cleaner, and also the corresponding oil way on the stator cover, which is that oil way just here. Look where you got this line, and that hole in the case there, if you blast some carburetor cleaner up there, you should get it coming out of the centre of this case. So you need to make sure that one's clear whilst you're in here and it's all apart. And then the rest of it is a reversal of the refit. So about to push this bearing back in now, and then balance the shaft back in, obviously torqued up to the correct with thread locked as well, but just refer to the service manual for all the details of that. It's very comprehensive, and there's corresponding photographs and everything you need to know. So we'll get this one fitted back together, and tomorrow I'll get some more back in it and start her up.